everyone. Thank you so very much for coming. My name is Meira Blaustein. Excuse me. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Woodstock Film Festival, and it's so great to be here at beautiful White Feather Farm. All our panels this year, as well as last year, have been taking place right here at the farm, and what a great place to have a gathering. Don't forget on your way out, if you haven't checked it out already, they have a beautiful organic farm stand where you can get some really good vegetables. It's a great place. I'm very thankful to Sarah Johnson, who owns White Feather Farm. I'm not seeing her here, but she is around. And Sarah Johnson and Dan Gallant, who runs it, thank you all so very much for hosting us. We have always great panel series. It's one of the most interesting, intimate, and really great opportunity for audience to meet and intimately interact with highly accomplished directors, writers, producers, actors. And ever since, I would say, 2004, the Woodstock Film Festival has been running what we used to call Amazing Women in Film. And we had a spotlight on women filmmakers. It's so important to support the work of women filmmakers and really bring it to a place where you don't have to do that anymore, because women and men and non-binaries will all be alike, and they'll be just getting the same kind of opportunities and creating the same level of work that it will be as successful. But the ladies here today will be talking about that and so much more. This panel is being presented, or co-presented rather, by NYWIF, New York Women in Film and Television. And to tell you about that, I'd like to invite board member of NYWIF, Kim Jackson. Come on up here.
Thank you, Meira. Yeah, I'm Kim Jackson. I'm a board member of NYWIF, which is New York Women in Film and Television. NYWIF is a nonprofit membership organization that advocates for women both in front of and behind the camera. And if you don't know much about it, go to the website, check it out. We do an incredible amount of programming. We offer education, scholarships, grants, and a lot of support for women advancing their careers. So we're really excited to be part of the Woodstock Film Festival again. And on behalf of the board of directors and our executive director, Cynthia Lopez, we bring to you today Women in Film, Then and Now. And I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Thelma Adams.
Thank you, Kim. We're mic'd up. We're getting mic'd up.
You're mic'd up. Okay, great.
Thank you, Kim. And if you have questions about NYWIF, New York Women in Film and Television, and how you can get involved, Kim. No, I'm saying that they could reach out to you. You can you can hand it.
I'm going to be over
anytime.
There. Yeah, I'll be right over there, and I'm at the festival.
We have more people. We had a wonderful discussion this morning with Deborah Granick, the fiercely independent crew, director of feature films and documentaries. It's not and, it would be fiction and nonfiction would be the appropriate way to put it. We have a wildly waving audience, and I am here joined, and we'll be quick. This is what we're going to do. We're going to talk for an hour, and then we're going to open it up to questions. That's basically what we're doing. So, it's pretty much like in and out. Next to me, I have the wonderful Karen Allen. my favorite, and also at the festival, she executive produced, developed with Sarah Schwab, and starred in A Stage of Twilight, opposite William Sadler, who also lives somewhere in this general area.
He does.
Because I used to take the Metro North up with him. I'd say, oh, it's William Sadler. She was also, you may remember, that she was also Marion in Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. And I would say the best Spielberg female role in his whole, no question. She might blush, no question. As well for many people of my, anyway, and she was also Katie in Animal House. I was going to reveal that big crush of my husband's, but big crush. And next to her, we have the next generation, or the next of next generations, Kelly O'Sullivan, already accomplished. She wrote and starred in St. Francis, hugely successful independent film. And now here, you have a short, My Summer Vacation, which is, has it already played?
It played last night as part of the Fight or Flight series, and it was awesome. Yeah.
And now, next, I have will co-direct Mouse in 2023. Is that happening?
That's happening, yeah.
And who's the star? I remember that the star is kind of.
We can't say who it is yet. Or Alex Stan, my partner who is going to co-direct it with me is here. He told me I couldn't say the name.
Change it. Let her say.
Don't tweet it, but it's Sandra Oh, which I'm super excited for.
Oh?
Don't tweet it, please.
In this barn of silence.
Yeah, the barn of silence. Yeah.
Oh no, now we know. Okay, and we have Julie Goldman, an Oscar-nominated, Emmy-winning documentary producer, and her works have included Life Animated, with
The director is right there.
yes. I was going to say and now Woodstock Film Festival, you're on the board of directors, yes? Yes. Robert Ross Williams, sitting in the back. She also did Buck, Manhunt, The Inside the Hunt for Osama bin Laden.
That's the subtitle of Manhunt.
Manhunt. Manhunt, colon.
Yes, exactly.
I didn't express the colon in the way I talk. And 1,000 Cuts is another one of her movies. So I'd like to welcome you here. Thank you. I think we have a really interesting combination of women on this panel. And it's interesting. I want to start out with a general thing. When I was listening, Karen, to you talk to Joe Donahue on WAMC, and that's kind of the lifeline of the Hudson Valley all the way into the Berkshires. It's our public radio. A Joe Donahue interview is so pleasant because he reads the books. He actually sees the movies. He actually cares. And when you were talking to him, I believe it was this week, you talked about how important for this film and also for many films, the festival circuit and the Woodstock Film Festival are. Can we start there and then we'll...
Sure. I mean, it's the lifeblood of independent films, the film festivals, and it's where films get a chance to be seen when they're first finished, and they have a life of their own, and whatever kind of distribution they may or may not get, there is an audience for them out there all across the country. I've been, in the beginning of my career, for the first, 20 or 25, 30 years, I very rarely went to film festivals, but now the film festival world, I think I do more indie films in the last 10 or 12 years, but also it just feels like the film festivals are flourishing everywhere. And every time, I just came from one in Port Townsend, Washington, and they're just so full of vitality and life, and the communities have come together to support them, and there's a real appetite for the kinds of films that we don't get to see in a multiplex, or even sometimes in the small, art theaters where the films are curated more carefully. But certainly documentaries have flourished through film festivals, and usually half of the film are documentaries, and it just seems like I feel there's a really wonderful future, for film festivals. I think they're going to continue to grow and continue to proliferate, and it's a good thing.
It's also a place to see great movies.
Oh yeah, without a doubt.
That's without a doubt. How many film festivals have you gone to, Kelly?
I went to a lot with St. Francis because it came out in 2019, right before the pandemic. So I felt really lucky that we got to go to Poland and Munich and Paris and all over the country. And now it's exciting because it feels like it's starting to happen again. It was a really sad period where it felt like all the festivals, of course, had to go dark. Because that experience of getting to see it, like even last night, seeing my short with an audience, I was like, oh, right, reaction. And the shared vibe in the room is so contagious and so uplifting that it's really nice to be back on the festival circuit again.
And Julie, you're in kind of a different position in that throughout all this time, women behind the lens were more common. Women producers were more common on the documentary side.
Yeah, very much so.
Do you want to
and
tell
directors.
people about that from the beginning? Like, give us an idea.
I mean, it's been, at least for the last 20 years, there's been kind of a huge number of women that are not only directing and producing, but shooting and editing. Amazing amount of women editors in documentary and crewing. It's just an even playing field because for a long time, documentaries were the ones that, you had very low budgets and you were, cramming together, and women were probably more willing to say, I'll jump in and do this. And that was where the experience started to, women were getting a lot more experience in these different roles, and then it took off in a different way. But I mean, it's interesting because, with the documentary branch of the Academy, when Roger was governor and we joined the exec committee, it was still amazing to me because it did not at all reflect what documentaries were at that time. It was still kind of run mostly by white guys. It was still populated by older white guys. And then by the time you finished being governor there had been a movement with the Academy, but also within the doc branch, and it's now mostly women. It's whatever it is, 60%, he probably knows.
Right.
But what it is, it's reflective in just these 5-6 years of what actually is the reality of the documentary world, which is quite different, I think. For our branch, it was really different, and I kind of think it speaks to what the documentary world is that we were able to achieve all these goals that the Academy set out, like in 2 years, because that was the reality of who we were. Whereas these other branches, I think, had a lot more difficulty, especially the tech branches, in finding gender parity.
Exactly.
And yeah.
And still. And it's interesting that
I don't know
you
why I
say...
was talking about the Academy, but yeah.
It's interesting what you say in the last 5 years, 5-6 years. Like,
Yeah.
what do you see? Like, we've been banging this drum for so long. It's almost like now I realize that we set this panel up, and it's a panel about women in film. And what we were hoping for in 2004, what we were striving for, what we were looking, we had Barbara Koppel then, who was, because she got an Academy Award for Harlan County, really was recognized as a director, but yet it wasn't, till Catherine Bigelow or later on that people said, oh, that's a director. But now now things have really changed. And why? Do you think that advocacy worked? Do you think that people are, where is the change?
Well, I've been able to see what I want to be. Gina Davis says, if you can see it, you can be it. That's the whole motto of her festival. And for me, looking at people like Greta Gerwig and Issa Rae and Olivia Wilde, because I started off as an actor, and then I was like, oh, we don't have to just be relegated to that, to just translation. We can be writers and directors as well. And so that's just by seeing people do that and by watching them excel, I was able to say, well, maybe I could write a script that I could also act in, and maybe I could move into directing even though I've never been to film school. Maybe I can take what I know as an actor and go from there. So for me, it's really seeing other women's example.
And do you feel that there were doors open for you when you decided to do that? Or was it, or is it the fact that St. Francis was like such a great script, and it just caught fire? Both things could happen.
Yeah, we made it on we were like the little engine that could. Nobody knew about us. And so I think it helps to be an underdog and then come out, like we made it in Chicago for like $150,000. And so then people were like, wait, this feels real. And we were like, yeah, we shot it in our real apartment, and there was so much that was real about it that I think that kind of authenticity, people can smell it. And so then it started getting talked about at South by, and it started growing from there because of the festival circuit. So I think in terms of, representation, women's stories are out there more and more. St. Francis is about abortion and about nannying, and I think because of representation, we're more accepting of those stories now.
I think to your point, what you're just saying, Thelma, is that, there have been these generations of women who have, kind of slowly broken down barriers where Kelly can say, oh, I have all these examples, and 10 years ago, you wouldn't have had those examples. So there is this kind of actual progress that you can see.
And I remember when Melissa Silverstein of Women in Hollywood was almost a lone voice, writing and screaming and saying, hey, Cannes, the film festival, there's no women directing. And she was like this voice. She was this voice out in the wilderness, and then I joined, and then many people, other people joined. But that drumbeat of demanding that Cannes, that Venice, that had equal representation, it took a long time. And again, I would say in the last 5 or 6 years, I remember going to Toronto and writing a piece for whoever I wrote at Yahoo, whatever, saying, where are the women? Mm-hmm. And then now they have huge inclusion programs. They really make sure that women, and not just women, are included. And so what I notice now as a film critic is how great the films by women are that I see, that I don't go see just because it's a film by women, but that I saw at the New York Film Festival, like After Sun, which is a first-time director. Fabulous movie with Paul Mescal. Or Corsage, which is a European female filmmaker. And it's just like there's so many good films out there now by women where the main thread, it's, a female carries the narrative arc, which I think is the definition of what you want. Like, I want female-driven films. Not everything, but that's something that is important to me.
Or at least you're seeing these films, and your favorite films in the year, they happen to be by women directors. And it's not that you went to see them because they're directed by women, but it's those films that pop or resonate in whatever ways, like Portrait of a Lady on Fire, or whatever it's going to be. Those kind of films that you're like, wow, that was like really one of my favorite films of last year, or Jane Campion, or whoever. It's about the quality of filmmaking that is there.
And also, I just want to say Petite Maman, which maybe was...
I love that film.
Like, have you guys seen it?
I haven't seen
Good.
it.
I mean, what I find interesting is that sometimes those kind of films are received as quiet, like this. And if I talk about a movie you haven't seen yet, just put it in your head and you can see it at Upstate when it comes. But like Women Talking, the Sarah Polley that's coming out that has everybody in it. It has Claire Foy, it has Judith Ivey, it has Jessie Buckley, it has Rooney Mara, it has Ben Whishaw. But it's most like this huge cast of women talking about sexual assault. But people come out and they're like, some people come out and they go, well, it's kind of quiet. It's kind of talky. And it's really an odd thing because I know it's also very triggering for women who have experienced sexual assault. So that the movie works on this assumption that people who get it are going to really get it and are really going to be moved. Yeah. And I'm there to be a part of that group, and to support that movie and not have critics who write, male critics who write, a little talky, kind of, not much happening. And I'm like, wait, the world happens in that movie.
That feels really sexist to say women talking is boring and
Right. Have you seen it?
No, I haven't.
Oh, yeah.
I really
Okay.
want to, yeah.
It's okay. Yeah, this is a battle that I've been fighting for a really long time. About if you have women's films, you have to have female critics.
Yeah.
Because
Right. And there's been so few
Yes.
of those. Yeah.
I've been beating that drum for so long. And I still go to critic screenings in the city, and I'm like, boy, 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 girl. But, and it has an impact on how women's films are seen, distributed, prioritized.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Because I do think and I'm going to go back to asking questions. I do think I'm looking for films that are authentic, that touch me. Or documentaries like, and I will never, the Nan Golden documentary that Laura Poitras did.
All the Beauty and the Bloodshed.
All the Beauty and the Bloodshed. I can never get both
great
of the
title.
B's. You know what? All the Beauty and the Bloodshed. I mean, that is such a moving documentary. It's such a moving story.
I'm going to see it in New York Film Festival, I hope, but I've heard it's fabulous. She's a really wonderful filmmaker.
Really wonderful. So, Karen, can you talk a little bit about when you started your career and you stepped, I don't really know if you stepped onto the set of Animal House and it began, or if you had been working before that.
Well, I'd been working in the theater before that.
Right.
So it was my very, very first film experience. I had never met an actor who'd been in a film. I'd never met a director who had directed I had no experience in the film world. And fortunately for me, that was true of about half the actors in the film. So there's a group of us all in the same seat of the pants boat. And it was fun. We just had a good time, and I learned a lot, and I was embarking on a whole new learning curve because there's a lot of similarities between theater and film, but there's a huge amount of differences in terms of how you need to learn to work. And it was a time, so I was when I got really interested in film just from an audience point of view was probably when I was in my late teens, early 20s. I lived in Washington, D.C., and there were these fantastic theaters called the Inner Circle, the Circle, and the Outer Circle. And I kind of lived in them. Right. And you could see 2 classic foreign films for $1. And if you were really clever, you could go to the bathroom and come out and then go over and see 2 classic American films. You bring a sandwich in your purse.
Sandwich in your purse.
You could smoke in the theater in those days, too. You sit back and smoke, watch films. But, there were a lot of female directors that I was Lena Wertmüller, Agnes Varda. France had more female directors than maybe any other country I can think of. But I think from my very first real falling in love with films, I never really saw that as a restriction, because I was watching films directed by women. So, and then when I started working in film, I think it was probably 10 years of making films before I worked with a female director.
And who was that? Do you remember?
Her name was Jenny Bowen, and she had done, I think it was her second film. And I don't know I think she left the business eventually. I think she did find it very difficult, to be a female director. And the next female director I worked with as well she had a rough time. So they were getting the jobs, or a lot of them were writing the films themselves and then somehow managing to raise the money to do the films. But it was a struggle, that's for sure. They didn't feel a lot of support in terms of the industry. And it was such a male, when I first started working in film, I was often there'd be 100 people working on the film, and there'd be 3 women, including the actresses. So I would often be the only actress in the film, and there was often somebody in costumes or somebody in hair and makeup, although sometimes those were male-dominated as well. So,
did you feel vulnerable?
No.
Were you aware of it? Like now we would be aware of it, but at the time,
I spent a year and a half when I was like 19, 20, 21, I left the United States and spent a year and a half traveling. I went from through Mexico, Central America, South America, and lived in some islands in the Caribbean. And I had this spirit of adventure. And for me, it was all an adventure. And I don't think that I felt very vulnerable. I think, I had a little streak of, I can do this, and it sometimes felt a little lonely. Like, there wasn't, there's a kind of male camaraderie on film sets that you don't really feel like you're a part of. But I didn't necessarily feel in any way uncomfortable in it. I was, and I had no brothers or anything. I didn't grow up in a very masculine world. We were a very female household. But I don't know, it just felt like an interesting way to live life.
Right.
To travel around the world and make films. It just seemed like, oh, this is something
Cool.
I can do.
And Kelly, how does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I mean, I feel lucky that now we're able to be intentional about putting female crew, because I think that matters so much.
Yeah.
And we still have to be really intentional about it, because most people are like, yeah, I know a guy who, most of the I know somebody is still I know a guy.
Yeah.
And so you have to be like, okay, but do you know any women who do that job? And they're like, oh yeah, I just haven't worked with her as much.
Right.
And so then it's about being like, well, let's talk to her too. And choosing to have more representation behind the camera, because it used to be, while there were a lot of actresses on set when I was an actor, it was all male behind the camera. So you would be acting with other women, but then you'd look out and everybody literally calling the shots was male. And that really affects the story and the ways that stories are being told. So, yeah.
You're nodding, Julie?
No, I'm just listening. I'm just interested. No, I mean, it's
it's a little different on documentary, but have there always, what about in terms of DPs? That's those big union tech behind the,
you can't afford that in documentary to go. It's generally much lower budgets, and I mean, not than indie films, but there's a lot of women DPs, and there have been for many, many years. Mary Salberti came out with documentaries, and a lot of other really talented women DPs who then now also do direct, or they certainly are DPs on fiction features and series. So, I think part of it is also that for many years, a lot of the decision makers, like the executives, Sheila Nevins or Nancy Abrahams, Lisa Heller, HBO, or Lisa Nishimura at Netflix, or Molly Thompson at A&E Indies and now at Apple. I mean, there's a lot of decision makers who can greenlight you who are women. So there's always been, or there hasn't always been, there has been for these last years a real level of support that's just quite different. I mean, I will say, David Zaslav runs that company, or whatever, Bob Iger, Bob Chapek runs that company. When it comes to the people who are whoever runs Apple now, those
decision makers.
Jeff Bezos, whoever is able to greenlight us, it's great, but it would be nice if some of those folks were women that were really at the top of the decision-making pole.
And maybe that's also something that we would like, would be to figure out a way that we could have more women financiers.
Yeah.
But still, given the economic inequality, I don't see that happening in the short term. But what do you think?
We have a lot of women financiers in
so
documentary. We have a lot of women who support documentaries. Again, I mean, I'm not trying to make it like it's so great in documentaries, but we have come to something that is really pretty extraordinary, I think, with the ability to, gender parity is just very different in docs, from that level of executive that can tell us to directors to producers. I mean, look, there's still there's recent articles that have been coming out about documentaries, and often it's, Alex Gibney and Ken Burns and not Michael Moore really anymore, but
Joe Berlinger, is he? Because he's here. I mean, not here.
Yeah.
But he's at the
Joe.
festival.
There's people that are more recognizable, but there's always Barbara Koppel, and there's always people like that who are women like that who have carved a path there at that level. But it just feels like there's a lot more parity on a lot of levels, including DPs, including editors. So I think, not to be Pollyanna, which I never am, I'm a very cynical New Yorker, and I feel like I'm like giving something the wrong vibe. But it just knowing, because I have a lot of friends who are, work in indie film and fiction features and series and actors who I'm friends with, and it's just harder. It's still not quite there. I hope that because of the success of documentaries, maybe we can lead the way in that.
Excellent. I mean, the good news is good news. We'll take it where we can get it.
Yeah.
I also, we were talking before about these things like, not in documentary, but the Sundance Bounce, where you had directors who came, when it was a male young director who had a successful Sundance movie, he was plucked to make the next big, whatever that was going to be, Lord of the Rings or some Star Wars or something. And I've talked to many female directors who had that moment at Sundance when they were at the Eccles and they were standing there with a giant audience of everybody adoring the film they made, and then crickets. And so we do kind of have this lost generation of women who didn't get to where they could have been if they had had an equal playing field.
But did they make more interesting films than some boring Lord of the Rings film? I don't
Yeah,
know.
that's
or like,
we had that question. We had the Greta Gerwig discussion about Barbie earlier this morning, for those of us who have been here. But that's another question. It's like, to make an interesting film, to make a film that, where is it going to show? What do you want? Again, this is almost a life question. You want to make films, you want to make female-driven films. Are you passionate enough to make the film you want to make because your budget is $150,000 instead of $15 million? That's kind of a moral decision that one makes, or an ethical decision about what they want their life to be.
Yeah, I don't want to work for that budget again. I'll just say, that was really hard. And so the goal is to keep taking steps up. I know why women go and they go do the Marvel movie, because you want to have resources. You want to have to not beg, borrow, and ask for favors, because our movie was made on favors. And you also don't want to ask people to work for nothing. Women on our set worked, they got paid, but they were like, I love this script, I believe in this script, I'll work for scale. But you can't do that for very long, because then people are like, oh, now I have kids, I have to pay the rent. And so you want the work to be able to take steps up.
So that's interesting. What's kind of, if you can look ahead a little bit, what do you think your roadmap is?
Our next film has a budget of $6 million, and that's the entire map that I have. That's the only thing that I know of next. And so we'll see how that goes, because it's also I don't know if that film will be received well. It feels like such a crapshoot on every single one that it's what's going to resonate?
Which is another issue between men and women in the past, is that idea that's just coming to mind. It's like Sidney Lumet made many, many, many movies, and I'm sure someone in the audience will say 43. But of those movies, 4 are brilliant, 4 are good, and then there's a lot, There's some that are not so good, whatever, The Wiz, But he was allowed to make. He made it possible, whether allowed or pushed. You have to make movies and fail.
Yeah.
And women have not had that luxury on the fiction side.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you could say that.
You could say that.
You could say that.
If you're a woman and you get it right, it could be an accident. And the next one is oh, okay, yeah, see, she wasn't good. Whereas if you're a man and you get it right, it's he's good.
Yeah. What do you think
Especially if you're
about
a white man?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
Because I do.
It's different.
I do think fiction is based on the white male auteur. That's still sort of the way people think about it, is the white male genius. And that behavior doesn't fly with women on set, or anybody who's not a straight white male in charge. And so it's an entirely different.
So how has that changed how you do? the controversial question is this, like, what happened on the set with Olivia Wilde that went wrong? But the less controversial question is, how do you envision changing a set so that it's comfortable for everybody, or that it works for I don't know if wanting it to be comfortable is the goal.
But I mean, how many films are directed by men that have whatever dynamics went on there that nobody knows about because it just stays there because it happens every time or every other time?
Right.
Why is Olivia Wilde, I have no opinion about Olivia Wilde particularly, but what I'm annoyed about is like,
Why is she crucified?
Yeah, why is she put on the rack when, because whatever, she was lovers with her actor? When does that not happen? I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, I've done like very little fiction. The fiction I've done, there have been those dynamics, and I just find it, appalling actually that she was treated that way, and also that, I mean, just it's because it's this moment where you can kind of be attacked, and then it just gets amplified in this unreal way.
Yeah, I agree.
And you're at Venice. I mean, and the press there's so many people covering it that they're all looking for an angle, and once there's an angle that's clickable, everybody proceeds. I am wondering, without basis, I'm wondering if Florence Pugh thought she was going to feel safe on set because she had Olivia as her director, and then she didn't feel safe because there was this stuff going on that has been going on forever, but she kind of thought wouldn't happen on a female-directed set. Theory.
But I mean, but what would happen if it was like we would never know about that if somebody felt safe with a guy and that happened. You would know.
No.
It says, don't worry, darling. Or Olivia Wilde
I'm
directed.
so glad
I'm
you
sorry.
don't know about this.
I know, it is
I
nice.
don't want to know about this. I was like, why is this
I love
endlessly
pop
in my
culture,
feed?
but I think it's deeply sexist what's happening. I also think we don't know what happened on that set. Like, Florence Pugh hasn't said anything. There have been all of these, like
the guy spitting, the whole thing. I mean, it was like everything about it was so ridiculous.
Yeah.
So that in the end, all you can say is both Olivia and Florence look fabulous in evening clothes.
Well, I will say it's scary to watch as a director, to be like, they're eating this person alive.
Yeah.
And that's intentional. And so to watch somebody who's risen to fame and has access then be punched down again or crucified, I do feel like, I mean, it gives me real pause to think about rising to a certain level of success, because it does feel like people want to topple a woman who rises.
Well, I think they want to topple a lot of people, but yes, they want to topple women.
Yeah.
And people of color and anybody who's not in the group. And also, I think that change is challenging for white men who had everything in their pockets until that moment, until people said
Sure it is.
I mean, I'm not saying it's justified. I'm just saying that they're pissed. We wouldn't have Trump otherwise, or whatever else, kind of thing. There's a lot of anger.
Yep. Change is uncomfortable.
Change is uncomfortable. One of the things, just going in a different direction, one of the things, before I get to, one of the things that's interesting in terms of the project that you have here, and is it showing again?
It's showing tomorrow at 4 in Socrates.
In Socrates at the Orpheum. A stage of twilight is something also you have to kind of be aware that you may be connected to a project for 7 years.
Well, I mean, I have been connected to this for 7 years.
Yeah, exactly.
It certainly wasn't the plan starting out that it would take 7 years, but it just came. The whole thing was born of a conversation. I was directing a play in New York City, and I sat down with a friend of the producers, and we were having a dinner, and she had just lost her father. I had a father who was starting to his health was starting to fail, and we got into conversations about end-of-life issues, and she was wanting to write about that, and we just started a series of conversations, and she started writing things, and she would give them to me, and I would read them and give her some feedback, and it then turned into a play, and it changed a lot over the 4 or 5 years. We did a lot of readings of it. We got audience feedback. We did some workshops at 2 different theaters where we just worked on the play for a week, and it developed and developed until it finally came into what we felt was a really, beautifully written play. And then about the time we were going to have a production, COVID hit. So it wasn't going to happen as a play anytime soon. And she just, in the stasis of the pandemic, she wrote it as a screenplay, and it changed a lot in that process as well. So I had this long kind of history with it in its development, which made it very satisfying when we actually, began to work on it and put it on film. It made it a very, kind of full experience, because I hadn't just read it a month before and dived into it. And
it was a COVID shoot. Excuse me, a COVID shoot.
We did shoot it during COVID, it was last summer, so a year ago this past summer. So there was a little sense of lull, I don't know. I mean, the crew had to wear their masks, and we had a COVID person on the set. We were all tested every other day. So there was still a lot of COVID protocols in place, which are still in place now, as far as I know. But but we were small. It was small. It was a small crew, a small group. We were in a little town in Connecticut, and it felt a little bit in a nice sort of creative bubble. Way. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What did you do, Julie, over the what films did you make?
We were busier than we ever had been during COVID. It was really crazy because we had actually in January at Sundance, Nanfu Wang, who did we did One Child Nation with, she was there. She was on the jury, and we were talking, and she had just come back from China. She had dropped her son off to stay with her mom, and she was like,
"What's her name?"
Nanfu Wang.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And she was like, something's going on. And then her husband had to go back and get him before they closed the borders. Her family lived really close to Wuhan. And so right away, she and her co-director from the previous film, who's produced this with us, started to gather, pull stuff offline. Because you can get stuff from China, but it goes really fast. You have to kind of stay up all night and grab it. And that became this film in the same breath, which was about the response in China to the crisis in Wuhan. And then, because she lives here, it became it's like 2 sides of the same coin. There was no information and the reaction of people, and here there was a lot of information with the reaction of people. It was just a very interesting comparison. But that was the first film that we shot, because we were shooting in January 2020 with that film, and we continued, and she had to she did the first interview over Zoom that she had ever done, and we were all saying, this is going to be awful, and it was amazing and emotional, and you did not know that she wasn't there. Wow. It was actually, and then she started to set up cameras and have people go in with COVID protection, but it was pretty incredible how quickly that kind of adaptation was really made, and we then were doing films the whole time. We had films that were because you couldn't really do fiction with sets and lots of actors and crew, but documentaries, you could find these ways to remotely do it. We filmed a film in Florida, which was I still can't believe we got away with that, about the genesis of the opioid crisis. So we had films that were going, and we had more films that were brought to us, and I think as soon as Tiger King exploded, everybody realized nonfiction right now is the way to kind of feed the beast of it's Netflix, and so we all have worked harder this period than I think any period.
And have you jumped into the streaming? Can you talk about that?
The streaming?
Or jumped into what would you say? Into the streaming, into a situation where there's a big demand for documentary, of constantly on all platforms, and a level of money. I don't know. It seems to me a level of money, but
it's funny. I was talking to somebody yesterday about it. I mean, the thing with Netflix that happened is they started to pay ridiculous money for documentaries. They inflated the market, and then they started to produce in-house so that they would commission you and fully own it, and they were much lower budgets. And so it was this weird kind of up and down moment scale-wise.
We call that a bait and switch.
Kind of. It was a bit. And so that was kind of the Netflix, but it's opened it up. And basically, though, like right now, there's certain films that there's, you hear about $30 million for Elton John, or, these documentaries. Certainly a lot of that goes to the artist, but there's this kind of expectation that we're in this like huge gold rush, but it's hugely disparate. It's there's a lot of young emerging filmmakers that are struggling to get any money to make films. There's topics that are not pop culture superstars, that kind of a thing.
True crime.
And true crime too, that are much harder to make. So it's a complicated moment right now. So the streamers, are definitely supporting documentary and nonfiction, but a certain kind to a large degree.
Yeah, Deborah was talking about, how they then say, well, in the first 10 minutes, you have to grab people.
Oh, the algorithms, yeah.
The algorithms. So what, do you want to tell me about that?
Oh,
I
they're
think people are aren't you fascinated with this?
No, it's amazing because they say things like, the 70s doesn't really work for us anymore, so don't focus on that. Or I'm like, how's the 70s not work? The 70s were great,
How can you say 10 years just doesn't,
Yeah, our
60s,
audience doesn't
yes,
like
80s,
this.
fine, but 70s?
But they'll say by minute this, you need to have, there's certain things. I mean, we have a lot more freedom because we've been around for a while and we're not easily pushed around, but we've had projects that, basically went into that rabbit hole, and it's really hard to get out when there's a certain, especially like we've done a film that's like a sequel kind of to a different film, and they're like, just make the same film, just different, like just change it a little bit, but here it needs to do the same thing, here it needs to do the same thing. So it can be tough to battle that. I think they also have, it's like, again, if it's somebody they trust, that you have a lot of freedom. But it's going to get worse when the stock drops. Those kind of mindsets get worse.
Yeah, and it's tanking. I want to open up to questions. Okay, but first, we have 2 microphones. Do we have 2 microphones? There's 1, 2. First, I'm going to say, please ask the owner of an orange Crosstrek to move their car. HAP 1253, blocking access in parking lot. Does that strike a bell with anybody?
There's no shame.
Yes, there is. Oh, no, there's no shame. Okay, well, I guess I don't see anybody jumping.
It's somebody at the market.
But we have questions.
Hi.
The wonderful Janet Grillo.
Hi, Julie. And great conversation, everybody. Julie, this is a question for you. I wonder, now that the doc space has become corporatized and there's a lot of money flow in it, and whereas docs was a space that women could thrive because there wasn't that kind of finance, do you think that that will reduce the amount of opportunity for women, and that men will now enter the space because it is a profit center?
So interesting. I would think that if women didn't have such a foothold already. I think, but I will say, with that in mind, I can think of like a handful of men that are getting enormous opportunities right now that are the higher budgets, those kind of huge budgets that people, like with sales, the 20 million, the 30 million. I don't think those, I can't think of women directors. Can you think of women directors that are getting that, or non-white male directors that are getting those? Yeah, I mean, it's that. So in that way, I think that does say something, that kind of ridiculous opportunity. But it's the same thing of like, I made an indie film and now I'm going to direct a, $150 million Marvel film. It's the same kind of thing.
Sundance bounce.
Right. It's in that way. But I think with that in mind, there's still a lot of opportunity in that kind of middle space, which is quite lucrative and quite decent. But it's that gigantic part of it is going to the same folks.
Another question. Do we have a question on this side here?
Thank you. Thank you so much for everything you've been sharing. It's really insightful. I'm just curious because I do feel like as a female filmmaker, I battle with talking the talk the way that men do, and coming into negotiations holding my power. And so I'm just curious if any of you have done any, I guess, negotiation training or any, I know there's even like master classes you can take, I think, I was told about them recently, to try to learn those negotiation skills. But yeah, for me, I feel like it's just to keep up with men, to be able to walk into a room and hold that space and hold my power to be on that level. And I, on one hand, admire it in men, but then also envy it and just wonder how to keep up.
I'm really in process with that. Truly. And I have to realize that sometimes my power is slightly different. I used to think that I had to talk a lot in meetings. And now I realize that just the substance of what I say is the power rather than the quantity, it's the quality, if I'm talking to the right people. But I will be very honest and say I'm deeply in process with that. I work with my romantic partner. He and I, after meetings, I'm like, I didn't say a word. Like, I felt so, when we talk about it all the time. And I have no answer other than, like, I think knowing that and knowing areas where you can grow and then also finding your own power, sort of the stability in your own voice really helps for me. Rather than thinking like, because I always think like, this is what a male director looks like, or this, this is what it has to be. And then I think there's a lot of power in saying, does it? Like, does it have to look like this version of powerful versus can owning your power look different than the way that it has for a long time?
And also the question is, are you the only woman in the room in those things, or is it you're also pitching to women executives?
Because of COVID, I guess, it's a lot of, like Sylvia and I have been working on this film for years.
What's it called? And when can we see it?
It's called Follow Her. The second screening is today, actually,
Follow
in
Her.
a few hours. Yeah. But we do a lot of our meetings on Zoom or over the phone. And those conversations are very much, I guess, led by men. And I personally have a really hard time getting my voice in, and I feel like I have to fight to get my voice in or cut people off. Mm-hmm. And like even working with sales teams or whoever, again, we're just always dealing with men still. And yeah, I have a hard time knowing when to speak and what to say, so I'll just feel myself getting smaller and smaller on those calls.
Yeah.
Some of the best advice I was ever given was that you don't have to be able to do it all. That there is, like, each one of us has our own strength, and that you want to then find and reach out to people who can work with you, who have different strengths than you have. Like, I definitely recognize in myself, if I speak creatively to people, that's where I feel like my strength is. I can tell a story and get people engaged in the story. But when it comes to the business aspects of it, or talking about the negotiations, or talking about money, or getting people to write checks, I just totally know. I'm still in process with that. It's not my strength at all. And I really need someone working with me, someone at my side, who can kind of fill in what I don't have. That doesn't come easily to me. And I think I always saw this as like a weakness, and yet, somebody, I forget who it was, the film festival that I'm on the board of, we do this thing called the Filmmakers Summit, and they invite all these extraordinary people up to talk. And this was a woman who was an attorney in the film business, and I'm not going to think of her name right now, but her advice was so helpful and so solid. She was speaking to all the young filmmakers that were there. And she was trying to say, don't think you have to know it all. Don't think that, you don't feel a lack of confidence because you aren't good at everything across the board. And it really freed me up. It made me think, oh, okay, I can embrace that part of myself a little bit, and just bring the people towards me that are strong in areas that I'm not.
I think it's also worth noting who is making you feel small and saying, do I want to work with somebody who makes me feel that way?
Yes.
on our
Like especially your sales team.
yeah.
Well, I can add, we're working with 2 men, and they're, experienced they sell films. But I know we have to have a different conversation with them, and we're always saying keep it really, as few words as possible, because men tend to speak in fewer words than women, and we get, we get more emotionally connected to things where they're just, their brain, and so we're always second guessing and saying, we can only ask 1 or 2 things in an email because they'll never get to 3 and 4. And I wonder, do you guys
Just
write
send
different
a lot of emails.
Do you write different, keep them short, but do you write different emails? Oh, this is to a man, I'm going to do this, I'm going to or you just say, screw
I
it.
send my emails to Leslie to vet them.
It depends who it is, but yeah, sometimes you'd break it up into emails for sure. There's also Sundance has like a Women in Finance Summit, or like a thing that they do in New York, or Women in Film, and it might be worth looking up because there are people that are kind of coaches or advisors for exactly what you're saying. If that is something, like to Karen's point, if that's something that you do want to, bolster or emphasize, there are people that seemed really good there that would do like that kind of like a training or a session or that kind of a thing to make you. I've never had that problem. My mom's a community activist and a powerhouse, and so I was like, I thought I had to be able to ask, because all she did is raise money and grants and everything. So I was like, okay, I just have to like go in and tell them I want money. So it was a very different thing because I had this guide in this way. But what's interesting is like my partner is also my husband, who's when we have meetings and we're asking about anything for money, I ask for the money. So that's I do the financial conversations. So
And what does he bring? What's his piece?
Well, he does like the editorial, the creative, we work on all of it together. But on that part particularly, I think he also is like, you should be the one asking. You should be the one putting that forward. Like because we've been together since we were babies. So yeah, it's kind of a good thing to if that's something that you want to build up, it's good to first of all, just find somebody who could like give you just some kind of, not hacks, but ways to kind of get past your own reticence.
Does NIWIFT have those kind of? Hi, Jane. Okay, welcome.
I just want to say, I feel that way too. That was actually I was going to say the same thing, that I feel like I'm always asking myself, what would a man say in this situation, and constantly kind of like weaving around things and being more careful. NIWIFT, the thing that was coming to mind is that NIWIFT has a writer's lab for women over 40, which if you are a screenwriter and a woman over 40, you should really look into this lab. That is really a place where we do a lot of mentoring and talking about this issue, because it also relates to getting management and representation, which is harder for women, and particularly women over 40. So I think to your point about Sundance and finding these places, NIWIF doesn't necessarily specifically have a specific program. We could do something about this, so this is good information. But finding labs and different programs within these festivals and within these organizations, because it's a really important conversation, and it's really unfortunate that so many of us, even at different levels, still feel just so insecure about some of these conversations that we find ourselves in, and thinking to ourselves, if I was a man, could I say that differently, but because I'm a woman, do I have to say it this way? And I just think it's a sad conversation, and we've seen it a lot in the Writers Lab, a lot of women who are just really struggling with that. So I hear you, and it's a real thing.
Yeah. Thank you.
I mean, our sales agent, I'm like, focus right now. I'm asking you 4 questions. You need to answer them. Like, I will say that, you need to, I know you're on your BlackBerry, because he has a BlackBerry. I know you're on this, stop, so, yeah.
You should teach a class.
I love that.
But I know him really well, so I can say it.
Hi, Karen. Tara Westwood, I have a short film. We were in the same block last night. I love your movie. It's fantastic. My film's, it's called Triggered. It's about gun violence. And we played at a different festival, and an interesting thing happened. Someone reached out to me and said, I watched your film, I loved it. I was sure while it was on that it was directed by a man because it's about gun violence. And it was so complex was the word that was used. And then at the end of it, when your name came up, I saw it was directed by a woman, and I thought, oh, that actually makes sense, because it was really, it really made me feel a lot. And I'm like, I don't know how I'm supposed to feel about any of these things that you're saying. And then at that festival, I won Best Female Director. And he said, and good for you that they had that category so you could win something.
Oh, lovely.
And again, I was like, ugh. And we've talked about, like, how do I feel about the fact that there was that category? I mean, right now I kind of feel okay about it, but I don't know.
When they handed you the trophy.
Let's pause for a second. You want. That's another thing we have to learn. When we have to breathe and say thank you.
Yes, and I'm grateful, but I'm curious how you all feel, because right now, although you said the goal is that we'll all be, whether we're black or white or male or female, we'll just be filmmakers. But right now we need to make our path, and we might need these categories. And I'm curious what you think about these categories, or do we want the categories now with the hope that they go away? I don't know if I'm making sense, but I'm curious how you feel about that.
I understand what you're saying. Yeah. I mean, I would like those categories to go away.
Yeah.
Yeah?
I mean, yeah, I would like there to be a category like Best Emerging Director, or so, Best New, but to divide it into male and female, I don't know how helpful that is, but I'm glad you won.
We're glad you won. And do you feel that way about acting too? That's a little bit more controversial. Like there should be a best actor and it should be gender.
No, not really, because I think that, when you have when you tell a story, I think it's such a broad field, acting, I mean, I like that. It's always a little difficult. I mean, I think it's difficult to choose the best film of the year. I mean, how do you compare some sort of, $300 million Marvel film to some beautiful indie film about a family in crisis? I mean, how do you, I don't think we do these things very well in terms of setting up the structure by which these are chosen. I don't love the idea of like a male and a female performance, being all put together in one field, or a supporting performance being put into the same field as a leading performance. I think that seems okay to me. I mean, maybe I've just grown up with that and I accept that more readily. But I think I always feel, the Academy does this thing now where, now it's 10 films, the 10 best films of the year. I usually, I can't even find 10 in their list. I can't. It's tough. But I feel like we need to kind of, with the largeness of the field of films now, we need to find a way to not necessarily, compare, a musical with a drama, with a comedy, with a small indie film. That we have to find a way, if we're going to celebrate films at the end of the year, to find a way where somehow there's a larger field. Yeah.
I guess along those lines, white male here, by the way. Sorry.
Okay, you're not the only one, so that's okay.
Curious as to how you guys have, because there's so many movies out there, so many documentaries, so many works of fiction, how you guys as a panel evaluate a new work that you haven't seen yet, whether it's for women representation. So, like, how do we know women are represented in this given work of fiction, for example? There's a test called the Bechdel test. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of it. Mm-hmm. I'm curious to your opinion on the Bechdel test, because it changed my perspective as a male to look at works of fiction specifically and say, are women represented? Me specifically, I don't know if people know, it's basically if the two leads are women and they talk to each other about something other than a man. That's the Bechdel test. And it's actually dishearteningly like rare in the works of fiction. I'm just wondering what the panel's
They have to have
opinion is.
names too. That's the other part of the Bechdel test, is they can't just be pharmacist. It has to be like Betty. I always think about the Bechdel test, and I think Ava DuVernay has now added to that and said, like, okay, but are there two non-white people who have names and talk about things that aren't white people? And I think about that all the time when I see movies, and when I walk out of it, I'm always like, okay, well, it failed those tests. Yeah.
Right. It's interesting because in Europe and European films, because the government funds movies, you do get a lot more women making films of the budgets that they're supporting, because it's a government agency, they have to be more fair in the distribution. And so there's a lot more women's films coming out, and also women's streaming television that are female driven. And ultimately, I think it will slowly happen here. The question, then the next question is, what's going to happen to movies like the ones that you're making? Not the documentaries, but the emotional, relatively small, female-driven, what I would have called, that would have played at the inner circle or the outer circle, in DC. I don't know where, I honestly don't know where that's going to land other than festivals.
You can see our movie St. Francis on Hulu. Like, they're out there, and like in Showtime.
Yeah,
like,
right. We have all these great, streaming networks and things now. I think, it seems to me, of all the indie films I've done in the last, 10 or 15 years, they'll get that kind of distribution that a lot of indie films will get, where they, they'll put it in 6 cities for 2 weeks. They have no money to advertise, and the film just kind of comes and goes, and it feels like now, if you can put it on Hulu, or it comes onto Netflix, or it goes onto Amazon, people are going to see it.
Right.
You can it will find its audience, hopefully. Whereas I felt like before, that old distribution structure, it was nothing. It just never, everything just sort of died on the vine, and you'd think, what happened to that film? Mm-hmm. I'd see films, that was me hitting my microphone.
That was you.
Sounded like the roof was going down. I'd see films I loved, and then they would just vanish into the ether. And I feel like now, they don't vanish into the ether. I can find them if I want to recommend them to somebody, or if I want to see them again.
And I would recommend on that, The Good House, that's coming out with Sigourney Weaver and Kevin Kline. Career topping. There's so many Sigourney Weaver great roles, so I'm not going to say this is her best, but a great movie led by Sigourney Weaver, from a couple, directed, written by a couple, so male and female, and about alcoholism ultimately. And Kevin Kline is in it, and they're wonderful together. They're in their 70s, they're wonderful. And it's like this wonderful, there was a place for this kind of movie. Maybe like a Still Alice, that someone would pick it up and try to get an Oscar run for it. And I don't, all I can do is bang the drum and say, hey, if you have a chance, go see it.
Is it in theaters?
It's going to be in theaters in like the next, I wrote the review, so it's probably in theaters, New York, LA, and it'll spread out. But even if you see it it's a movie you can see on streaming that's really, really good. So, question?
Yes, hi there.
Hi.
So I'm an actor who's done both theater and film. So I have a question for those who have acted and also are director-writer. So one, how has your experience as an actor informed your work as a writer and a director? And for Karen, how would you characterize the difference between directing for theater versus for film?
Well, I've only done one short film as a director, and I've done quite a few plays. For me, I really had a resistance to directing a film. I loved the you know, the containment of directing in the theater. I love that, you know, I had my designers and my stage manager and the actors, and you know, I got to spend 8-9 hours a day with them working together to develop something. And I kind of people kept saying, "Don't you get to direct a film?" And I was kind of pushed towards it, you know, by a friend of mine who is a producer who really wanted to see me make that leap. And it was not a leap I thought I wanted to make, and yet I had a wonderful experience doing the film. So it's, you know, in the simplest way, I mean, I think with this I directed a short film, I spent 3 years working on this film, trying to raise the money to do it, getting it put together, all the pre-production shot, getting it, you know, pulling together. Then we went off on the film festival route. And I mean, it wasn't exclusively what I did for 3 years, but it took up a huge part of my psyche and my day-to-day for 3 years. And what I love about working in the theater is how contained it is. You direct a play, and maybe I'll be with them for another 3 weeks after it's up on the stage, and then I'm done. And then my work is done, and I leave it in their capable hands. And I think that's the big difference for me. And maybe just, you know, I think there's so many moving pieces to a film, and I think some of my resistance was having been on film sets for so much of my life, and for a moment I couldn't even think that it was not a complex experience. And I knew that I would be moving into a world that had a lot of, you know, where people are constantly asking you questions, and you're constantly having to make decisions, and
you have to control things.
Yeah, and you know, I of course discovered that it's just a matter of doing so much preparation and being so ready when you actually show up on the set that it will hopefully go as smoothly as you want it to do. But there's so many things that can go wrong. I mean, our first day of shooting, something went wrong with the chip in the camera, and we lost the entire day. And, you know, there's just all those kinds of. We lost a main location. Like, there's so many things that can go wrong that are, you know, it's a kind of wonderful challenge in many ways.
Keeps you sleepless, right? I'm like, if I have all those details in my head, I'm like solving them as I sleep.
Yeah.
Which I don't want to do.
What about you? What
more questions?
Well, yeah, I'll answer the first part of the question, if that's okay.
Sure, please do.
I was just going to say real fast that I think acting has made me a better writer because I write from an emotional place. I know how a scene should feel, and I think sometimes for directors it can be very very visual based, which I think is an incredible skill, and that is not mine. But I'm able to direct and I think write from an emotional place, and also think like, I've had to say terrible dialogue before. I don't want to do that to anybody. Yeah. Like, I don't want to put words in their mouth that they're going to be like, ugh. And because I've been a part of so many new play workshops, I workshop all my scripts like that. So I've taken everything that I've learned as an actor and then said, okay, and now I'm just going to move one chair over into the writer position. But I've taken everything that I've learned from it, and it's really helped.
Thanks. More questions? We have about 5-10 more minutes. A couple of questions.
Thank you so much for everything you've been talking about. It's just been incredible. I had a question. So, you know, we've been talking about this idea of like, well, how do we talk to men, and how can we like make ourselves okay with men, basically? And my thought is, you know, with the success of Bridgerton, with the success of like, there's a Christmas Prince 3, which of course Netflix doesn't release their numbers, but I'm assuming it's doing well. And there is a huge female audience, and we know that from the research, right? Isn't it something like 80% of household decisions are made by women? So my question is, how can we get the executives and the financiers to actually like court us And to embrace, all too often, I see like quote unquote girly material as being thought of as stupid or less than say, I don't know, like a more typically male genre that, you know, maybe like a Quentin Tarantino movie, right? He's an auteur and that's amazing, right? But Bridgerton is like really stupid, but okay, but it broke Netflix, right? So my question is, how can we wake up financiers and executives to the enormous financial business potential that there is in giving female content makers the opportunity to make very, very feminine material?
Well, I would just let you know, Hunger Games, there's an example like Twilight, Hunger Games, all of these things that were, had a huge female audience. And I wrote about it in Variety, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago. We've been hitting that bell, and certain things have changed. But people with power don't want to give it up, and it'll take some more time. But it has in the past 5 or 6 years, in the past 15 years, it has really improved. And the way that it improves is making great shit.
I will say, like, all the meetings I've been on recently, half of the executives have been female, which has been really cool. And I don't know if that's because our first film was like a female-centric film, and so those are the people who are reaching out to us. But there's no lack of, you know, at the executive level, it feels like a lot of people are women. Now, I don't know how high up the ladder they are and what level they're decision-making at, but they're going to rise. And I'm really inspired by that.
How are we on the question front? We have another one here. Do we have anybody? I'm going to take 2 more questions. How about that? Unless there's another like 3 that are desperate for a question. Okay.
Hi, thank you all for your audacity to be in the film world. I really appreciate it. We touched on the political, and maybe all of this is kind of inevitably political, but do you have examples of working within film where you or the film that you've been on or been developing has had things as simple as maybe diversity clauses, or something more like worked at the state level with film offices, or even more worked within government petitioning to have things like healthcare access, abortion access, things that make the field more even for women to participate at the same level? When you talked about French films, and I think about the healthcare in different countries and the access to childcare, things that are inevitably or at least historically gender divided. Do you have examples of film having impact, like real person-to-person impact in law, and ways that have reflected that on your sets?
Not in law, but I have a friend who just directed a feature, and she had childcare on set, and they did 8-hour days.
Wow.
And it was an independent movie that I think was like $300,000. And so it was a huge priority for them. And that wasn't mandated, that was just a choice. And so as we go into our next one, I don't know that we'll be able to do that exactly, but we want to do 10-hour days, and we want to, we're going to probably shoot in the South, and so have to figure out about abortion access. And it's definitely part of the conversations that I'm having.
Excellent. Any other questions? One more last question, or are we all good? I see a question here.
It's more just it's something to think about on a cross-cultural, kind of echoing this, is I think perhaps the root of the issue here, and I'm speaking as someone who's lived in 6 different countries, is for a length of time and worked there, is this is culturally a very hyper-masculine society. And this includes, and of course women are going to echo that. And I think that might be part of the reason why that so-called women-centric storytelling is harder to get marketed, to get the financing, where you don't find this great divide in other societies. You might have, I kind of disagree that over in Europe, because of the funding, which I'm very familiar with, specifically to France, but it's still male, the directors, they still are running things. But I think the stories that they're making, you will find many more female protagonists. But we do come from a very, and women are as influenced as others, and I'm thinking that one actress who, or director who did something about the Kuwait, or I'm sorry, the war and occupation to Iraq, which I sat back and said, if this isn't a DOD war propaganda film, I don't know what is. So I use that just that we're all influenced by the larger culture. And it's something I think one should be very mindful of, and it doesn't matter if you're whatever your gender or cultural background is, the dominant culture is still going to be working its power on us, and we have to become mindful. But being a film lover, and I'll tell you, you can get tickets in Paris, and you can, 100 euros, and you can see a zillion films, and they still have those little film cinemas like in DC, and I'm from DC. Right. So the Biograph no longer exists. The only one now left is really the Avalon up at Chevy Chase. But anyway, the bottom line, I really think just in a cross-cultural is I think as Americans, we really need to become more mindful of just thinking the guns. This is a real hyper, not to mention paranoid, but hyper masculine society. And I'm thinking of
So what you're saying is that we have to put this in context of the fact that
this
is
to become
happening.
mindful.
Right.
We can't change if we ourselves are in its seduction. And I think of what Wilke, in a nutshell, what Wilke, a poet, Czech but German culture poet, said about love, but I think it's relevant to all that's been said here. A woman won't change. I'm not doing justice to the poet, but I'll give it a go. Won't change until she ceases to identify herself and define herself from the external, the male. And only until she does that from within will both genders evolve to a place that they actually are longing to be. And again, I'm not doing justice to Wilke, but more or less.
And I would answer and say, we have 3 women here who are working from deep within to tell female stories, human stories, whether nonfiction or fiction. And it has been today just an absolute pleasure to sit.
I want to give a plug for our film tomorrow.
Oh, hold on, we need a plug.
Yes, our film tonight, actually, The Return of Tanya Tucker, featuring Brandy Carlisle at Bearsville at 6:30, and it's a beautiful intergenerational story between these 2 women that hopefully you can see.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, I think we're done with questions, but I would say this also next up. We have a wonderful panel with Ariana Bracco from IFC, and the moderator is Marion Coltai-Levine, who is dear to my heart. And I think that IFC is really growing and changing, and they have among my favorite movies coming up, Corsage, which was directed by a woman and stars Vicky Krieps, a name that if you don't know yet, you will know.
Oh, she's wonderful.
She's wonderful. Yeah. So I want to thank you and thank New York Women in Film and Television, thank Meira, thank Woodstock Film Festival, thank Sarah for this wonderful venue, and go out and see movies.
Yeah.